I had barely kicked off my heels and loosened the pins in my hair when the phone rang. It was 11 p.m., the night of my own wedding, a night that was supposed to be drenched in love and beginnings, not in endings. My hands, still trembling from the champagne toasts and the weight of the day, reached for the phone with a curious smile on my lips. But the second I heard his voice, the smile evaporated. Ethan's tone was flat, cruel, almost rehearsed. "I don't need you anymore." The words sliced through me like glass, heavy and irreversible, and for a heartbeat I forgot how to breathe. This wasn't the man I had just vowed to spend my life with. It was a stranger wearing his skin. I froze in place, staring at the pale reflection of myself in the vanity mirror of our hotel suite. My white dress clung to me like a ghost, the veil discarded in a heap on the chair. For a moment I waited for laughter, for him to say it was some sick joke, but the silence that followed was merciless. I felt my pulse rise in my ears, but no tears came. That surprised me most, not the cruelty, but my own calm. Because deep down, part of me had been waiting for this moment. Ethan had always carried shadows in his eyes, secrets he thought he hid, but tonight he confirmed everything I had feared, and everything I had prepared for. Images of the day flashed across my mind like broken glass. The aisle lined with roses, my mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, friends whispering that I looked radiant, and Ethan, standing there, his smile perfect for the crowd but hollow up close. I remembered how his hand felt like ice when he placed the ring on my finger, how he didn't quite meet my gaze when he repeated his vows. Everyone clapped, believing in the fairy tale, but I had felt the fracture in my chest already. Love was supposed to be warm, grounding, but all I felt was a staged performance, something I had been coerced into more than swept into. I wanted to scream into the phone, to demand why, but instead, I listened to my own breathing, steady and sharp, like a predator holding back. If Ethan thought I was naive, if he thought I'd collapse under his betrayal, then he didn't know me at all. His voice carried arrogance, as though he had just won some secret game I wasn't aware of. "Don't make this harder, Hannah," he said, as if I were the one clinging. My lips curled into a smile no one could see. Let him believe his illusion. Let him think I was weak, fragile, incapable. He had no idea what I had already done. I leaned back against the vanity, my mind spiraling back to how fast this all had happened. Ethan swept me off my feet, or so everyone thought. A whirlwind romance, a proposal that seemed like a dream. He had pressed for a quick wedding, claiming he couldn't wait to start our lives together. But beneath his urgency, I sensed something rotten. There were calls he silenced, documents he tucked away, conversations that ended the moment I entered the room. My gut told me he didn't want me. He wanted something I had. And tonight, at 11 p.m., he thought he had won his prize. The thought made my chest ache with both rage and relief. Rage, because I deserved more than a man who saw me as a transaction. Relief, because I had trusted my instincts and acted before it was too late. I remembered the week before the wedding, the way I walked into the bank with shaking hands and transferred every last piece of my inheritance, every asset, every account, into my mother's name. Ethan had no idea that the treasure chest he thought he was marrying into was already locked and placed far beyond his reach. Tonight, his declaration wasn't the ending of my life, it was the undoing of his plan. The wedding replayed in fragments, the clinking glasses, the first dance, the way Ethan's fingers pressed too tightly on my waist as if he were holding property instead of a woman. My friends teased me about how lucky I was to find someone so successful, so charming. They didn't see the cracks I saw. They didn't notice how his smile never reached his eyes when he looked at me. They didn't notice the way he spoke of our future, but never once used the word love. I danced under fairy lights, but all I felt was the suffocating awareness that I was stepping into a cage built from my own family's expectations. I thought of my parents, of how they had adored Ethan. My mother had called him perfect. My father had joked about finally having a son-in-law who could carry the family name with pride. They were blinded by his polished manners, the way he charmed everyone at dinners. No one saw the calculation in his movements, the hunger behind his words. No one but me. And now, as his words echoed in my ear, "I don't need you anymore," I felt strangely vindicated. They hadn't listened when I voiced my doubts, but they would see soon enough. They would see who Ethan truly was. My fingers gripped the phone tighter, nails digging into my palm, but my voice came out steady. "All right," I whispered, letting the word linger like smoke between us. His silence faltered for a second, surprised maybe, expecting sobs or pleading, but I gave him nothing. Let him think I had surrendered. Let him savor his false victory, because what he didn't know would shatter him. The game he thought he was playing ended before it even began. When the call ended, I placed the phone gently on the vanity and looked at myself in the mirror again. The woman staring back wasn't the trembling bride who had walked down the aisle hours ago. She was steel-wrapped in silk, calm in the face of betrayal, burning with a fire no one could extinguish. Ethan had declared war without knowing the battlefield was mine, and as I slipped off the wedding ring and placed it beside the discarded veil, I whispered to my reflection, "If he thinks I'm weak, he's wrong." I still remember the first time I saw Ethan. It felt like stepping into a scene from someone else's life, not mine. He was standing at the far end of a crowded gallery opening, tailored suit sharp against the pale backdrop of abstract paintings, holding a glass of red wine like it belonged in his hand. People hovered near him as if drawn by gravity, their laughter quick to rise at his words. When his eyes finally met mine across the room, something in me faltered. He smiled, slow and deliberate, as though he had chosen me out of everyone there. For a girl who grew up with little more than her mother's tired hands and second-hand dreams, it was intoxicating to be noticed by someone like him. Ethan was a man people wanted to be or to be near. He spoke about business with confidence, but without arrogance, or so it seemed. He had money, connections, and a way of weaving every conversation so you felt like the most important person in the room. He told me he had come from humble beginnings, though his expensive watch and imported shoes suggested otherwise. Ambition glowed in him like heat from a fire, the kind you wanted to stand close to even if it burned. He was admired everywhere we went, shaking hands, remembered by name, always leaving a wake of admiration behind him. Being chosen by him made me feel chosen by the world. My own world until then had been small, held together by my mother, Ruth. She had raised me alone after my father's sudden death, piecing together a modest living through long hours at the library where she worked. Our home was nothing glamorous. Second-hand furniture, the smell of old books, evenings filled with quiet resilience rather than extravagance. Ruth always said we had love, and that was enough. So when Ethan stepped into my life, offering me champagne dinners and weekend getaways, it was as though I'd been lifted into a story I had only read about in novels. He represented everything I thought was just out of reach. The spark between us ignited quickly, too quickly for me to question. One evening he sent flowers so large they barely fit through the door. The next, he whisked me away to a rooftop restaurant with a view of the entire city glittering beneath us. His attention was a spotlight, and I stood frozen in it, dazzled. People whispered that we were the perfect couple, his charisma balanced by my quiet grace, his confidence filling the spaces where I hesitated. It was a whirlwind romance, one that left me dizzy, swept up in something I didn't fully understand, but didn't dare resist. And yet, beneath the whirlwind, there were whispers of something darker. Ethan's attention often came with invisible strings. He flattered me endlessly, my hair, my smile, the way I carried myself, but he also began to shape me. "Don't wear that color, it washes you out," he'd say lightly, though his tone carried weight. If I canceled plans with friends, he praised me for prioritizing him. If I disagreed with him in public, he brushed my words aside with a smile that never reached his eyes. It was subtle, easy to excuse as protectiveness or taste, but a quiet unease took root in me. Jealousy came next, cloaked in concern. A simple phone call from a male colleague could spark questions that sounded like jokes but lingered in the air. "You like the attention, don't you?" he'd murmur with a half smile, leaving me unsure whether to laugh or defend myself. At first I dismissed it as passion, as proof he cared, but the way his grip tightened on my arm at crowded events, the way he sometimes lowered his voice into something sharp when no one else was listening, told a different story. Each moment was small enough to overlook, yet together, they formed a chain I didn't notice I was wearing. Ruth noticed, though. Mothers always do. She never confronted him directly, but her eyes followed him like a hawk's whenever he came to dinner. One night, after he left, she sat me down in the kitchen, her hands folded tightly around her teacup. "He smiles too wide, Hannah," she said softly, not unkindly. "A man who hides behind his charm is a man you should be careful with." I laughed nervously, assuring her that Ethan was just different, that she didn't understand him, but her words dug deep, buried under my heart, waiting for the day they would bloom into warnings I could no longer ignore. I was torn between the love I thought I felt and the unease that kept me awake at night. How could something that looked so perfect feel so fragile underneath? I wanted to believe in Ethan's promises, in the way he looked at me as though I were the only woman in the world. Yet the shadow in his eyes, the subtle ways he nudged my choices, the way my mother's voice lingered in my ear, they all tangled into a knot of confusion. Love, I told myself, was supposed to demand compromise. Maybe this was simply what compromise looked like. When Ethan proposed, it felt like stepping into a dream I had rehearsed since girlhood. The ring glittered under the lights of a private rooftop, a sparkling diamond against the city skyline. He knelt with practiced grace, his voice steady as he promised me forever. My breath caught, my eyes filled, and despite every warning bell inside me, I said yes. The applause from the restaurant below floated upward like music, sealing me into a choice I didn't fully understand. In that moment, I silenced every doubt. He was the perfect stranger who had chosen me, and I convinced myself that was enough. The engagement was a performance, dazzling and suffocating all at once. Ethan seemed determined to outdo himself with every gesture. A surprise weekend in Paris, a necklace that sparkled like captured stars, dinners in restaurants where the bill could have covered our rent for a month. People whispered that I was the luckiest woman alive, and I tried to believe them. Each new extravagance was a wall of glitter hiding the shadows I felt creeping closer. I smiled through photographs, posed in borrowed glamour, while inside I felt the weight of something sharp pressing against the fairy tale. Ethan insisted on taking charge of our finances, always with the excuse that he was planning for our future. He opened accounts in both our names but kept the details vague, brushing aside my questions with affectionate dismissals. "Trust me, Hannah," he'd say, his voice honeyed but firm. "You shouldn't have to worry about numbers and paperwork. That's my job. You just focus on us." On the surface, it sounded protective, even chivalrous, but the way he spoke left no room for me, no space for my own decisions, no air for independence. And I, against my better judgment, let him take the reins. One evening I came home earlier than he expected. The sound of his voice carried from the study, low and clipped, sharper than I'd ever heard. He spoke quickly, words tangled with frustration. "No, she doesn't know. She won't find out. Just handle it." My steps froze midair. The silence after his words pressed against me like a hand over my mouth. When I finally entered the room, he was smiling, phone tucked away, as if nothing had happened. "Business call," he said, his tone light, his eyes watchful. I nodded, but unease settled inside me like a stone. Ruth sensed the storm long before I could name it. During fittings for the wedding dress, she hovered with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp on Ethan when he wasn't looking. "He's building a cage, Hannah," she whispered once, her fingers brushing against the silk of the gown as though the fabric itself might bind me. "You're mistaking control for devotion." I brushed her off, embarrassed by her suspicion, even irritated. Yet the way her words sank into me, like pins pressed into delicate fabric, remained long after I left the room. Ethan's mask of charm began to slip in small, startling ways. Whenever I asserted myself, choosing a menu without asking him, insisting on paying for a dress alteration, even defending Ruth when he made a sly comment, his patience cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and he would murmur something under his breath that didn't match the smile on his lips. These were fleeting moments, easy to overlook, but they stained the edges of my happiness. I began to wonder who he was when no one else was watching, and if I had ever really known him at all. The inconsistencies in his stories about money grew harder to ignore. One week, he bragged about closing a major deal worth millions. The next, he insisted we needed to be strategic and cut back on small expenses. When I asked for clarity, he grew vague, spinning explanations so polished they felt rehearsed. I wanted to believe him, wanted to protect the dream he had woven around us. But doubt became a constant whisper in my ear, a voice that grew louder each time I noticed another crack in his carefully curated life. As wedding preparations intensified, the pressure only grew. Every detail, flowers, music, seating arrangements, became another stage for Ethan to display his dominance. He corrected me in front of planners, dismissed my preferences with a wave, and spoke as though I were a supporting role in a production starring him. I smiled through it all, afraid of what people would see if I let the mask slip. Friends cooed over the romance, the extravagance, the dream wedding. No one saw the shadow under the silk, the unease threaded into every stitch of my dress. My gut screamed louder with every passing day. At night, while Ethan slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I was stepping into something I wouldn't be able to escape. The image of him on the phone haunted me, the sharpness of his tone, the secrecy in his words. Yet every time doubt threatened to consume me, I silenced it with one fragile belief: love. I told myself that love meant faith, that love meant trusting even when you couldn't explain why. I wrapped myself in that word like a blanket, even as it began to suffocate me. On the morning of the wedding, I stood before the mirror, draped in white silk that shimmered under the light. My reflection looked radiant, a bride glowing with happiness. But behind my smile, a storm churned in my chest. I thought of my mother's warnings, of the phone call I wasn't supposed to hear, of the way Ethan's eyes sometimes looked at me like I was both a prize and a possession. My gut told me to run, but my heart, or maybe my fear, told me to stay. And so I silenced myself once more, choosing the illusion of love over the certainty of my doubts. It was a week before the wedding when my mother summoned me to her house with a voice that left no room for excuses. I arrived expecting another argument, another plea for me to reconsider the marriage. Instead, Ruth greeted me with papers spread across the dining table, her hands trembling but her eyes sharp with determination. "Sit down, Hannah," she said, her voice low. "You need to see this." My heart stuttered in my chest as I glanced at the documents, sensing that what I was about to discover could unravel the fragile future I had convinced myself to believe in. The papers spoke louder than any of Ruth's warnings ever had. Bank statements riddled with overdrafts, unpaid loans under Ethan's name, credit cards maxed to their limits, his wealth, his polished image, his effortless charm. None of it was real. The man I thought was building an empire was actually standing on sinking sand. Ruth tapped her finger against a particular statement, her jaw tight. "This isn't a man who loves you, Hannah. This is a man drowning, and he wants to use you as his lifeline." The words struck me like glass shattering against stone. The blow deepened when Ruth slid across another folder. Legal notes, highlighted lines, and a copy of my father's will. Ethan had dug into every detail of my small inheritance, money I rarely even thought about. "He's marrying you for this," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking, though her eyes remained fierce. "Not for love, for survival." I stared at the numbers, the legal jargon, the undeniable evidence. My chest tightened, a suffocating mix of betrayal and heartbreak. The fairy tale I had clung to crumbled into ash right there on my mother's dining table. For the first time, I felt the full weight of his lies. Every extravagant gift, every controlling gesture, every vague explanation about money, they were threads in a web he had spun around me. It wasn't passion that had driven his whirlwind romance. It wasn't destiny or love. It was desperation, greed, and the cold calculation of a man who saw me not as a partner, but as an asset. My hands shook as I tried to process it, my mind racing between fury and sorrow, between the girl who wanted to believe and the woman who was beginning to wake. Ruth reached across the table and gripped my hands with surprising strength. "You can still protect yourself. Transfer the assets into my name. Let him believe you're still blind, but don't walk into that marriage unarmed." Her words rang like both warning and salvation. The thought of betraying Ethan felt twisted, yet the reality was clear. He had betrayed me first. If I did nothing, I would lose everything. My inheritance, my independence, and maybe even myself. A quiet strength began to flicker inside me, a fragile flame that grew steadier the longer I looked at those damning papers. I agreed, not with fireworks or defiance, but with a soft, exhausted nod that carried the weight of broken illusions. That night, Ruth and I began the process in silence, signing papers, making transfers, ensuring every coin and contract slipped out of Ethan's reach. My tears stained the ink, but my resolve anchored me to each signature. By the time we finished, my inheritance no longer belonged to me. It was safeguarded by Ruth, shielded from Ethan's grasp. For the first time since he walked into my life, I felt the ground beneath me steady. Alone in my room that evening, I allowed myself to cry. Not the gentle tears of heartbreak, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook my body. I wept for the woman I had been, the one who believed in the fairy tale, the one who mistook control for protection and lies for devotion. Yet when the tears finally subsided, what remained was something new. My reflection in the mirror no longer looked naive. My eyes were rimmed red but filled with a quiet defiance. Ethan thought he had found a victim. Instead, he had created an opponent. From that moment forward, I played my role with precision. I smiled when he boasted about our future, kissed him when he asked for affection, let him believe I was still blind to his schemes. But inside, every word he spoke was filtered through the truth Ruth had given me. Every lie he told added fuel to the fire of my resolve. I was no longer walking into a wedding as a girl dreaming of love. I was stepping into a battlefield disguised in white silk, armed with knowledge he didn't suspect I had. In the quiet of the night, as I lay awake beside him, I whispered a promise to myself. He would not break me. He would not strip me of everything I had left. If Ethan wanted to play a game of deception, I would let him, until the day came when I turned his own lies back on him. For now, I would let him think he was winning. But deep down, I knew the truth. The first move was his, but the last one would be mine. The church was dressed like a dream, soft ivory flowers cascading from every corner, golden light streaming through stained glass windows, music swelling with gentle reverence. To everyone watching, it was the perfect wedding. A radiant bride, a dashing groom, families united in joy. Yet beneath the lace veil and the steady rhythm of my steps down the aisle, I carried a truth that none of them could see. The dress clung to my body like a costume, and each smile I offered to the crowd was a mask. Beauty covered everything that day, but behind the beauty lay a silent battlefield. Ethan played his part flawlessly. His tuxedo fit him like it had been tailored by destiny itself, his smile gleaming with practiced ease, his every gesture polished as if he had rehearsed them before a mirror. To the guests, he was the epitome of charm, the storybook groom who had captured the heart of a modest young woman. He kissed my hand gently as if he worshipped me, his voice steady and warm as he spoke the vows. But I knew what lay behind the curtain of his performance: debts, lies, and desperation hidden beneath the surface of that perfect smile. I repeated the vows with a voice that barely trembled, though each word felt hollow, carved out of duty rather than devotion. For richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, the words lodged like stones in my throat, and I swallowed them down, determined not to falter. This was no longer a promise of love. It was a ritual, a shield, a necessary step in a plan that Ethan would never see coming. I wore my silence like armor, hiding my truth behind carefully painted lips. The congregation saw a radiant bride. Ethan saw his prize. But Ruth saw everything. From the pews, my mother's eyes never left me. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but the set of her jaw carried the weight of defiance. To anyone else, it looked like a mother overwhelmed with joy. To me, it was a signal. We know, we're ready, we won't let him win. Each time my gaze brushed against hers, a spark of strength lit within me, reminding me of the signatures, the documents, the quiet revolution we had already set in motion. Ethan thought he was the puppeteer pulling my strings. He had no idea that Ruth and I had already cut the threads. The reception bloomed like a carnival of celebration. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter spilled from every corner. The dance floor glittered with light. Guests toasted to forever happiness, oblivious to the cracks beneath the surface. Ethan basked in the glow of admiration, shaking hands, embracing friends, drinking deeply of victory. I drifted through the crowd like a ghost draped in silk, smiling when expected, nodding at compliments, offering thanks that rang empty in my ears. The night spun around me, loud and bright, but within I felt nothing. My heart was steady, my mind already elsewhere. Every toast was a dagger dressed in honey. To Hannah and Ethan, may their love be eternal. To a life filled with prosperity and joy. The words circled me, each one laced with irony. I lifted my glass, sipped the champagne, and let the bitterness spread across my tongue. Ruth's hand found mine once during the celebration, a fleeting touch beneath the tablecloth, grounding me in the storm of falsehoods. She knew the emptiness of my silence, the numbness that had settled into my bones. To the world, I was the happiest bride alive. To myself, I was an actress in the cruelest play. Ethan's eyes glimmered with triumph as the night wore on. He looked at me not with tenderness, but with possession, the way a man admires a painting he has bought at a high price. His hand rested firmly at the small of my back as though to remind me, and perhaps the room, that I belonged to him now, that he had won. Each time he leaned close, his breath carrying promises of a future he would never control, I bit back a smile that might have betrayed me. He thought the stage was his. He had no idea the script was already rewritten. As the final song played and the guests began to drift away, I sat at the head table, staring into the half-empty glass in my hand. My mind was calm, almost eerily so, as if a storm had passed and left me with an open, silent sky. Around me, the remnants of laughter echoed, but inside, I was calculating, waiting, breathing in the quiet certainty of what I carried. I had not lost. I had not surrendered. Ethan's world of illusions was closing in, and soon he would feel the walls shift beneath him. When Ethan pulled me close that night, whispering about our future, his eyes gleamed with victory. He thought he had trapped me, secured me, conquered me. But as his lips brushed against my ear, I kept my own thoughts locked deep within. You'll learn tonight. My silence was not weakness. It was a blade he could not yet see. And when the time came to use it, he would finally understand the cost of underestimating me. The room was still dressed in the remnants of celebration, bouquet wilting on the dresser, veil tossed over a chair, faint perfume lingering in the air. I sat at the edge of the bed, my wedding dress now exchanged for a simple nightgown, my body heavy with exhaustion. Yet sleep would not come. At exactly 11, the sharp buzz of my phone cut through the silence. My hand hovered over the screen for a moment, my breath caught in my chest. I already knew it was him. The timing, the precision. It was deliberate. Ethan was about to drop the mask he had worn all day. I answered without speaking, and his voice slid through the receiver, stripped of charm, stripped of tenderness. "I don't need you anymore," he said, cold as steel, each syllable deliberate. The warmth he had poured into his vows only hours earlier had vanished like smoke. He no longer performed for an audience. This was Ethan unmasked. My fingers tightened around the phone, but I made no sound. Silence became my shield, my choice. His words poured out like venom, and I let them sink into the quiet. He spoke with arrogance, savoring every confession as though it were a victory chant. "You were useful, Hannah. Pretty face, trusting heart, and the inheritance, let's not forget that. But now the money will be under my control, and with it, my freedom. I don't need your love, never did." Each declaration landed with the weight of betrayal, but instead of breaking me, they built a strange, calm fire inside. He thought he was dismantling me. He had no idea he was only setting the stage for his own collapse. I remembered Ruth's trembling hands as she signed the final documents only days earlier. The assets transferred, the accounts shielded, the safety net woven tightly enough to catch us both. Ethan thought he was speaking to a defeated woman, but in reality, he was already clawing at smoke. The inheritance he lusted for was no longer within reach. I pictured his face if he knew, the rage that would twist his carefully constructed mask. The image steadied me, a secret weapon pressed close to my chest. Rage and calm warred inside me as his cruelty deepened. "Did you really think love was enough?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're too naive, too soft. I could see it from the beginning. The perfect victim, a woman desperate to be wanted." His laughter followed, sharp and merciless, echoing in my ear like glass shattering. For a moment, the rage threatened to consume me, to spill out in words that would expose everything. But I bit it back, pressing my lips together until they ached. Silence unnerved him, and I sensed it. He wanted tears, protests, pleas for forgiveness. He wanted the taste of my humiliation to sweeten his victory, but I gave him nothing. I let the weight of his arrogance hang in the air, allowed him to believe in his triumph. My composure was not weakness, it was calculation. Each second I refused to respond was another thread binding him to the trap he had so carefully set for himself. He thought he had conquered me. He was blind to the truth that I had already slipped free. Finally, I whispered, my voice steady, almost detached. "Is that all?" The question hung between us, bare and chilling, like a knife pressed against his throat. For a brief moment there was silence on his end, as if he hadn't expected me to stand so still in the storm. Then he scoffed, muttered something about me, learning soon enough, and the line went dead. I stared at the darkened screen, my reflection faintly visible. I did not look like a bride. I looked like someone reborn in the ashes of betrayal. The room felt heavier after the call, shadows clinging to the corners like watchful eyes. But instead of despair, a strange calm flowed through me. My tears had dried before they ever reached the surface. My body no longer shook with doubt. All that remained was clarity. Ethan had revealed himself completely, his greed, his cruelty, his contempt, and in doing so, he had given me the gift of certainty. There would be no more hesitation, no more silencing my instincts in the name of love. That night became the first step of my quiet revenge. I lay down on the bed, phone still in my hand, and let the silence wrap around me like armor. Ethan believed he had triumphed at last, but I knew differently. I had seen the hollowness beneath his victory, the emptiness of his promises. In the darkness, with my heart steady and my mind sharpened, I whispered into the night, "You don't need me, Ethan? Good, because I no longer need you either." The sun spilled into the living room as though nothing had changed, painting the walls with soft gold. Ethan arrived home late in the morning, still in the glow of his imagined triumph, his shoulders squared and his stride purposeful. He moved as though he owned not just the room, but me, the air, the very future. I was already seated at the table with a cup of tea, my face carefully arranged into neutrality, my lips curved in a small domestic smile, the kind he expected. Beneath it, my chest throbbed with the echo of his midnight words. He didn't notice. Men like Ethan rarely looked past their own reflection. He kissed the top of my head, perfunctory, a gesture without warmth, and then dropped his jacket across the chair. "Morning, Mrs. Langford," he said, with a smugness that scratched against my ears. The title, my new name, was spoken like a trophy. I sipped my tea, hiding the tremor in my fingers. He didn't see that I was listening to every syllable, every twitch of his mouth, like a scientist observing a specimen. He thought he was in control. He thought I was already broken. The mask slipped faster than I expected. No more charm, no more soft inflections. His words were clipped, impatient, laced with disdain. "You'll need to adjust your habits," he announced between bites of breakfast he hadn't cooked. "We'll be tightening expenses. I'll take over the accounts. You're not exactly savvy with money." The insult was disguised as practicality, but the sneer in his tone gave it away. He didn't care if it hurt. In fact, he wanted it to. Pain fed his pride. Ruth entered the kitchen then, humming softly as though she were oblivious to the tension that had shifted the air. She poured herself coffee, her eyes flicking briefly to mine, just enough for me to catch the glint of understanding. To Ethan, she played the part of the dutiful mother-in-law, warm and naive, entirely unthreatening. But her silence was an alliance, her calm a shield. Without a word, she reminded me that I was not alone. We were two actresses sharing the same stage, while Ethan believed himself the director. The cracks in his arrogance appeared quickly. He spoke too loudly, bragged too much, tripped over inconsistencies in his own stories. He boasted about investments that didn't exist, hinted at connections that sounded increasingly fabricated. "Once I have everything consolidated," he said, puffing out his chest, "we'll finally live the way I deserve. Not we deserve. I deserve." Each slip revealed the hollow core beneath his grand facade. He was no genius mastermind. He was a desperate man dressing greed as ambition. His obsession with money hung on every word. He checked his phone constantly, scrolling through balances, tapping at apps with frustration. "Do you realize what kind of life we could have if you weren't so attached to Ruth's old-fashioned ways?" he sneered. The irony nearly made me laugh. He didn't know Ruth had already cut the golden thread he chased. Every sentence he spoke was another rope around his own neck, and he tightened it with pride, with arrogance, with that ridiculous certainty that he was untouchable. I sat quietly, absorbing his insults with a composure that unsettled even me. "You're awfully quiet," he snapped at one point, as though silence itself were an act of rebellion. I only smiled faintly and reached for my cup. It infuriated him that I didn't react. He wanted resistance he could crush, tears he could mock, anger he could dismiss. Instead, I offered him serenity, an unreadable face that mirrored nothing. He didn't know I was memorizing every word, every flaw, every weakness. Ruth played her role perfectly, fussing about the kitchen while slipping me subtle nods of reassurance. She asked Ethan harmless questions that poked at his lies, watching him stumble, then covered her smirk with a sip of coffee. Together, without speaking, we were dismantling him piece by piece. He still believed we were ornaments in his new kingdom. He didn't realize we were witnesses, chroniclers of every misstep, every cruelty. His mask had fallen, and what was left was brittle, pitiful, desperate. By the end of the day, I understood something with bone-deep clarity. Ethan's downfall wouldn't need much effort from me. His pride would do the work. His lies would unravel on their own. His hunger would consume him faster than any revenge I could devise. All I had to do was wait, smiling quietly, appearing soft, letting him believe in his illusion of control. In truth, he was already building his own ruin, brick by arrogant brick, and I would be there to watch it fall. The first sign of his panic arrived with the sound of hurried footsteps and the slam of the study door. Ethan had spent the entire morning locked inside, papers rustling, the clicking of his keyboard rising to frantic rhythms. I lingered in the hallway, pretending to dust the shelves, though every sound tightened around my chest. He thought he was about to open the treasure chest, to finally gain access to my accounts and consolidate his victory. Instead, he found emptiness, a void where his future should have been. I didn't need to see his face to know his confidence had fractured. He stormed into the kitchen minutes later, his expression a storm barely contained. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice cracking through the air like a whip. I tilted my head, deliberately slow, feigning confusion as though I had no idea what he meant. "The accounts," he barked, slamming his phone onto the counter. "The money, it's gone." His fists trembled against the marble, veins bulging at his temples. In that moment, the mask was not just slipping, it was shattering, exposing the raw desperation beneath. I widened my eyes, letting my voice drip with practiced innocence. "Gone? That doesn't make sense. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake?" The mockery of the question wasn't lost on him. I saw it flicker in his eyes. His breathing grew ragged, fury rising like a tide that threatened to drown him. He circled me like a predator, his body taut with restrained violence. "Don't play dumb, Hannah. I know you moved it." I folded my hands calmly, lowering my gaze, letting him mistake composure for weakness. Ruth entered the room just as his anger reached its peak. She moved with her usual serenity, setting a tray of tea down as though the world weren't cracking open around us. Ethan snapped toward her, venom in his voice. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Ruth didn't flinch. She met his glare with a steady calm that unsettled him more than any threat could. "The accounts are safe," she said evenly, her words carrying the weight of a verdict. "And they are under my name now, permanently." His jaw dropped, fury twisting his face into something grotesque. "You can't do that," he shouted, but the hollowness in his tone betrayed his disbelief. He wanted control, but it had already slipped beyond his reach. Ruth didn't raise her voice, didn't tremble. I already did. The silence that followed was a knife pressed to his throat. For the first time, Ethan looked small, cornered, not triumphant. His arrogance faltered under the weight of reality. The rage that erupted was volcanic. He threw his glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor like his broken pride. His threats tumbled out, sharp and bitter. "You'll regret this. Both of you. I'll ruin you. I'll take back what's mine." But even in his fury, the hollowness echoed louder. He wasn't the victor anymore. He was a man drowning in the very greed that had driven him. His voice cracked, his movements sloppy, his power unraveling. I should have been terrified, and part of me was. The heat in his eyes was dangerous, unhinged, but alongside the fear bloomed something else. Triumph. For once, he wasn't the one dictating the script. For once, his cruelty had no stage. I saw him as he truly was, pathetic, flailing, powerless. My silence was no longer submission. It was defiance. Every calm breath I took was a reminder that he had lost. Ruth stepped closer, her presence steady as a mountain. "Leave your threats at the door, Ethan," she said softly, almost maternally. "You have nothing. Not the accounts. Not Hannah. Not even the illusion of control." He shook his head, unable to accept the truth, his hands twitching like a gambler realizing the dice were rigged. His rage didn't scare her. She had stared into storms before, and knew how to wait until they burned themselves out. As he stormed out of the kitchen, slamming doors behind him, I felt the tremor in my hands finally release. The danger wasn't gone. If anything, it was sharpening. But he had revealed himself fully, his mask in pieces on the ground. He could shout, threaten, rage until the walls shook, but none of it could conjure the money back into his grasp. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't just surviving. I was standing on the edge of his ruin, watching the spiral begin. The first crack in Ethan's empire came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Calls he had counted on for loans went unanswered. Promises of investment vanished into thin air. Former friends, the ones who had clinked glasses with him in celebration just months earlier, now kept their distance. One by one, the people who once adorned his world with prestige and charm abandoned him. They had smelled the rot, the lies beneath his tailored suits, and they no longer wanted to be complicit. Ethan's confidence wavered, and his steps that once seemed so sure became unsteady. He tried to manipulate me, reaching for old habits, But I was no longer the timid woman who had waited for his smiles to dictate her world. "Hannah, you don't understand. I need this. Let me explain," he begged, his voice a mixture of desperation and veiled threats. I met his gaze steadily, icy and unflinching, allowing him no foothold. His words bounced off the walls of my resolve like stones against steel. I watched him unravel with quiet satisfaction. He had mistaken my silence for submission, my calm for weakness, but he was mistaken. Ruth became my shield and my ally in full view. She had begun sharing pieces of the truth with Ethan's associates, carefully exposing his lies and exaggerations. "You heard him," she would say, her voice calm but unyielding. "His numbers don't add up. His promises are empty. Judge for yourself." The words spread like wildfire through his network, each revelation cutting deeper than any argument. Ethan's reputation, once a fortress, crumbled with alarming speed. Those who once bowed now questioned, mocked, and finally turned away. Panic began to twist his face into grotesque expressions. His grand gestures, meant to intimidate or charm, became frantic and absurd. Every plan he tried to execute met with obstacles he hadn't anticipated. Every phone call he made ended in disappointment or rejection. Every attempt to regain control over me or the money ended in futility. The man who had once swaggered through life as if the world were his playground was now a prisoner of his own hubris. Desperation bled through him when he finally faced me directly, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and pleading. "Hannah, please, I can fix this. Just give me a chance." He reached toward me, a gesture meant to convey intimacy and trust, but I stepped back, holding the line. The trembling in his hands, the unsteady lilt in his voice, the shallow panic in his eyes. It was everything I had feared and everything I had prepared for. I was no longer afraid. I was resolute. For a fleeting moment, I remembered the girl I had once been, the timid, trusting Hannah, who had fallen for charm and polished lies. She had been frightened of conflict, afraid of asserting herself, but that girl no longer existed. I had grown stronger in the crucible of deception and betrayal, tempered by Ruth's unwavering support and the clarity of truth. I had learned to watch, to wait, and to wield silence like a blade. The timid girl was gone. Standing tall, I delivered my own verdict without a word. My posture, my steady gaze, my calm breath, it was enough to unmoor him completely. He had no path forward, no weapon left to wield, no threat that could penetrate the armor I had built. "I won't help you," I said softly, letting each syllable hang in the air. There was no malice in my tone, only certainty. The reality sank into him like ice water. He had lost everything he thought he possessed. Ethan's face contorted in disbelief, then anger, then despair. He had not only lost the money he craved, he had lost control over me, the one person he had assumed would obey. Every scheme he had counted on, every manipulation, every carefully calculated move, crumbled. The illusions he had built around himself now lay shattered at his feet. I could see the realization dawning in him, slow and agonizing, as he comprehended the full scope of his defeat. With him disarmed and impotent, I began to reclaim what he had tried to take from me: freedom, dignity, and the power to dictate my own life. The air in the house felt lighter, untainted by his suffocating presence. I moved through each room with purpose, feeling the steady pulse of my independence. For the first time since we met, I was not defined by his needs, his desires, or his deceit. The victory was quiet but complete, and it was mine alone. Morning light spilled through the curtains, warm and unyielding, washing the room in clarity. Hannah sat at the edge of her bed, letting the weight of the past weeks settle around her like dust. The lies, the manipulations, the midnight phone calls, they all replayed in her mind, each memory sharper than the last. Pain had once been her companion, fear her constant shadow, but now a sense of awakening pulsed through her veins, steady and strong. She breathed deeply, feeling the armor of truth settle over her heart, a shield she had forged in silence. The confrontation came quietly, almost politely. Ethan, desperate to reclaim some fragment of his imagined power, appeared at the door, his expression a mixture of hope and desperation. "Hannah, please, just one chance. I made mistakes, but I need you," he pleaded, his voice trembling like a candle in the wind. But it was too late for forgiveness, too late for manipulation. His words, once sharp enough to wound, now fell harmlessly against the walls of her resolve. Hannah rose slowly, letting her presence fill the room. Her gaze was unwavering, calm, but resolute, each step deliberate. "You never had me, Ethan," she said, her voice low but cutting through the tension like steel. He faltered, stunned, unable to comprehend the shift in power. "You only thought you did. You never owned my trust, my heart, or my life. Every plan you made, every scheme, it all failed before it even began." Her words left no space for argument. Truth had finally spoken. Ethan's face twisted with disbelief and fury, then slowly with defeat. He realized too late that his empire, built on lies and greed, had collapsed entirely. No money, no control, no one to obey him. He was reduced to the empty man beneath the mask he had worn so proudly. Without a word, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving a silence that hummed with finality. His departure was not dramatic, but it carried the weight of complete and utter failure. Hannah exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. Ruth stepped forward, her presence warm and steady. They embraced, and Hannah allowed herself to lean into the support that had carried her through every betrayal, every sleepless night. Gratitude filled her chest for her mother's wisdom, her guidance, and her unwavering protection. "I couldn't have done this without you," Hannah whispered, the relief in her voice almost sacred. The symbolic act came next, quiet and deliberate. Hannah signed her life fully under her own name, each stroke of the pen a reclamation of autonomy, a declaration that no one, not Ethan, not anyone else, would ever dictate her destiny again. The legal documents were a tangible marker, yes, but the true significance lay in the ritual itself, marking herself as free, as fully in charge of her life. Each word, each letter, carried the weight of hard-won liberation. She made a vow silently, a promise to herself that no one would ever silence her or manipulate her again. Strength hummed in her chest, mingled with relief, pride, and the faint sweetness of revenge properly measured and executed. Hannah had endured, had watched, had waited, and had acted when the time was right. The past could no longer hold her. The lies could no longer bind her. Every step she had taken led her here, whole, free, and resolute. As she walked through the rooms of her home, sunlight spilling through every corner, she felt a weight lift from her soul. The house, once shadowed with tension and deceit, now breathed with quiet peace. Every wall, every floorboard seemed to echo her triumph. The future lay open, unclaimed, but hers to shape. Hannah had not only survived, but had emerged stronger, sharper, and wiser. Her life was no longer dictated by anyone else's ambition or cruelty, and as she paused by the window, looking out at the horizon, Ruth's words echoed in her mind, a mantra she would carry forever. "Live boldly, Hannah. Let truth be your armor." Hannah smiled, a deep, unshakable smile, and felt the fullness of her freedom. The storm had passed, leaving her standing tall, unbroken, a woman reborn in the ashes of deceit, ready to write the story she deserved.